I'm Matthew Spaulding, Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. Hillsdale College was founded in 1844 by Free Will Baptists, proclaiming themselves grateful to God for the inestimable blessings resulting from the prevalence of civil and religious liberty and intelligent piety in the land, believing that the diffusion of sound learning is essential to the perpetuity of these blessings. Hillsdale was the first college to prohibit in its charter any discrimination based on race, religion, or sex, and was an early force in the abolition of slavery. It was the second college in the United States to grant four-year liberal arts degrees to women. It has held its core policy of non-discrimination and today rejects federally funded grants and loans from the federal government and instead supports its students with privately funded grants, loans, and scholarships. The college considers itself a trustee of modern man's intellectual and spiritual inheritance from the Judeo-Christian faith and the Greco-Roman culture, a heritage finding its clearest expression in the American experiment with self-government. Hillsdale's Kirby Center here in Washington, D.C. extends the college's mission by teaching students and congressional staff, public and political leaders about the first principles of liberty and constitutional government, to prepare and shape citizens and statesmen necessary to preserve our constitutional republic. Our speaker today is a friend of the college and a statesman. A graduate of Brigham Young University and BYU's law school, he was a law clerk to Judge D. Benson of the U.S. District Court, the District of Utah, and Judge Samuel Alito, Jr. on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. After several years as an attorney specializing in appellate and Supreme Court litigation, he served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Salt Lake City, arguing cases before the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. He served as general counsel for the governor of Utah and later was redrafted to work again, now for Justice Alito, on the U.S. Supreme Court for a one-year clerkship. In 2010, he was elected as Utah's 16th senator. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee, where he is chairman of the Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights Subcommittee. He also serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. He is currently chairman of the Senate Steering Committee. Please join me in welcoming United States Senator Mike Lee, speaking today on conserving religious liberty for all.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I always enjoy coming to Hillsdale College, and thank you, Matt, for all you do for Hillsdale College and through the Kirby Center. Everything that you do really advances the cause of liberty in our politics and in our schools and throughout our society, and I'm deeply grateful to you for that. It's always important in any free society like ours, to have institutions like Hillsdale College and like the Kirby Center that teach and defend the principles that have made us who we truly are as a nation. But it is indispensable at this moment in our nation's history when cherished ideals are being questioned, and in some cases, they're being threatened as never before. Today, I'd like to discuss the challenges and opportunities presented by the vulnerability of one of those ideals in particular, and that is America's tradition of religious diversity, tolerance, and freedom. In countless ways, our tradition of religious liberty is best thought of as the dog that didn't bark. Americans in general stand at risk of taking for granted religious toleration and pluralism because, blessedly, we've really never known anything else. We've never known this not to be the case. We have no comparable scars or memories of the sectarian violence that has plagued mankind in almost every other time and place throughout the world and throughout the history of the world. And so that very fact can make it difficult for us to appreciate fully the monumental achievement that our religious freedom represents here in America, and also the radical departure that it was from the various cultures and parts of the world from whence we came. You see, for most of human history, prior to America's founding, a free conscience was not seen as an essential human good. Instead, it was seen as something of a threat. From Athens to Rome to London, human beings everywhere believed that religion was too important a choice to be left to individual choice. The city of God was submitted for safekeeping to the city of man. So from ancient tribes to modern empires, governments derived their authority from the church, and vice versa. Uniform obedience to the established religion was enforced by the state, and dissent from official orthodoxy was outlawed. Minority faiths were suppressed, and heresy was punished as a crime. America was different, not by accident or chance or whim, but by design. Because America was founded by men and women, families and congregations, who turned the oppression of the ages inside out. We, insisted that religion is simply too important, too essential, too central to human happiness and to social flourishing, to be managed by and subject to the whims of mere politicians. These were the pilgrims, the dissenters, and the conscientious objectors who had the courage to flee religious persecution in the old world. And they also had the conviction to build a community of religious liberty in the new world. They were extraordinary men and women, but they had an extraordinary and even more extraordinary devotion to the belief that it is not only possible, but necessary to render the things that are Caesar's unto Caesar, and to render to God the things that are God's. The principle they established was not mere religious toleration, but religious liberty. There is, you see, an important difference between these two things. Under a policy of religious toleration, religious dissenters are accepted at the discretion of those in power, but they're still understood and treated as others. Religious liberty, on the other hand, is very different. It's a principle rooted in the natural right of human beings to the free exercise of religion. In a letter to the Jewish congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, George Washington praised religious liberty in America as going far beyond mere religious toleration. You see, in America, Washington wrote, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. In practice, religious liberty in America has meant that the government's job is not to tell people what to believe or how to discharge their religious duties, but to protect the space for all people of all faiths and of no faith at all, to seek religious truth and to order their lives accordingly as they see fit. No matter who you are or where you come from, regardless of your race or wealth, your political affiliation, or your sexual orientation, to be free in America is to know you won't be forced to compromise your conscience at the price of your citizenship. Like so much else that has made America great and exceptional, religion here breathes in the natural human space between the isolated individual and the overwhelming, overpowering state. This space, created by our cooperative culture and protected by our constitutional law, is where Americans have always been free to come together as equals, to live and to love and to pursue our happiness. Now, government's role, as it pertains to religion and most everything else, is not to direct our interactions within that space, so much as it is to ensure that all Americans have equal access to it and equal opportunity within it. When it comes to religion specifically, there have been isolated episodes in our history when Americans have fallen short of this standard, including during the early history of my own church. But this has always been the standard nonetheless, and deviations from it have been simply that, deviations. Thus, the First Amendment's famous declaration that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The framers' intention here was not to scrub religion from the public square, but to ensure religion's equal and enriching access to the public square. This meant welcoming people and churches of all faiths and people of no faith to form and to follow their religious beliefs without interference or regulation from the state. It meant permitting government officials to promote and encourage an environment where religion can flourish, and even to partner with religious institutions when appropriate. And above all, it meant placing religions on an equal footing before the law. So long as they aren't threatening the public order, the government must protect the right of individuals and their associations to follow their conscience and adhere to the obligations of their faith. This policy is more than just a matter of compromise, and it's more than a simple matter of convenience. It is the proper application of human rights and human dignity to the law. In an essay arguing against state establishment of religion, James Madison wrote over 2 centuries ago, quote, "It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society." This is how religion has been understood in America, as precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of the state. It's why religious liberty has always been given exceptionally robust legal protections against government interference and intrusion and infringement. And it's why Americans can be at once so religious and at the same time, for the same reasons, so religiously tolerant. In short, America has gotten religious liberty right from the very beginning, and we are all, every one of us, witnesses to that very fateful, fortunate fact. We all know, and indeed many of us are, individuals who have personally benefited in a very real, tangible way from America's commitment to religious liberty. But those benefits extend far, far beyond the progress reached by individual pilgrims. Every great social reform movement in American history, and this is true from abolition and civil rights to the struggles for women's equality and labor rights, to the pro-life movement today, all of these things have grown out of individual Americans' religious convictions and their constitutionally protected right to live those convictions out, to act in conformity with those convictions. All Americans of all faiths, and those of none, have benefited equally from our nation's unique commitment to religious liberty. Religious liberty, as it has been lived in America, is not, to be sure, a mere accident of history, and it's not a mere quirk of the law. It is nothing less than a culture-defining human achievement. Yet, recent events suggest resoundingly that it could be losing ground. And we can't accept this. We can't stand back. We can't tolerate it. We can't just let it happen. The great American commitment to religious liberty and diversity may still be universally successful, but it is no longer universally shared. This turn toward intolerance, tragically, has been catalyzed by the campaign for legal recognition of gay marriage. Like many Americans, I personally do not believe that same-sex marriage is a constitutional requirement or a federal prerogative, or even good policy for that matter. But today, those of us who hold these views cannot deny that our arguments are no longer winning the public debate. Sometimes, in a democracy, the other side wins. Yet today, at the very moment that this particular campaign appears to be on the brink of success, having appealed to the country with the principles of justice, tolerance, and equality, many within that movement find themselves tempted to abandon the principles and the people that have made them successful. Most advocates of marriage equality are no more radical than most advocates of traditional marriage, just as most followers of Jesus are no more radical than most followers of Moses or Muhammad or Buddha. But just as radical fundamentalists exist in every religious sect, so too can they be found at the extremes of otherwise healthy political movements. We all know the symptoms of this temptation, seeking not tolerance for their own opinions, but intolerance toward others, seeking not to persuade dissenters, but to punish them, seeking not to debate, but to demonize. Every week, there seems to be another warning on the horizon, another story more reminiscent of an Orwellian dystopia or a theocratic inquisition than the tolerant society that all of us know and most of us still fervently, passionately believe in. There is the case of Aaron and Melissa Klein, the husband and wife duo who ran a small bakery in Oregon and were recently fined $135,000 for declining to bake a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding ceremony. $135,000. And this came after protests and boycotts forced the Kleins to shut down their bakery, which could no longer survive. Then there's Julia Ward, a marriage counselor who was kicked out of her graduate degree program for referring same-sex couples to other counselors who didn't share her particular religious convictions about marriage. And then just a few weeks ago, there was the ominous exchange between my former boss, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, and U.S. Solicitor General Donald Verrilli during oral arguments in the gay marriage case that's now pending before the Supreme Court. Answering a question about IRS regulations from Justice Alito, Solicitor General Verrilli seemed to suggest that the Obama administration would be comfortable with the notion that the IRS could revoke the tax-exempt status of religious institutions, including schools, that maintain the traditional definition of marriage and stand by that definition. This exchange suddenly raised the possibility that political leaders on the left, who only recently joined the ranks of the marriage equality movement themselves, do not in fact stand with the tolerant national majority of that movement. Instead, they seem to be tempted by the intolerant impulse to push Americans who hold the same view President Obama and Secretary Clinton did while running for president just a few years ago. Regardless of how the Supreme Court rules in this particular case, it's becoming increasingly clear that the next controversies will not be over whether gay couples should receive marriage licenses, but instead, whether people who don't think so may keep their business licenses, whether colleges that don't think so will be able to keep their accreditation, whether military chaplains who don't think so will be court-martialed, whether churches who don't think so will be targeted for reprisal by the state, whether heterodox religious belief itself will be swept entirely from the public square. But as Father Richard John Newhouse warned us just a few years ago, quote, "The naked public square cannot remain naked. Politics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Something is not simply eliminated, it is displaced by something else," close quote. For the secular fundamentalists who believe marriage equality must result in religious inequality, the something else they insert in place of our open pluralistic society is submission to their secular creed. The creed is simple. Americans may believe whatever they want, but they may publicly express and act upon only those beliefs that the government approves. As ever, to the fundamentalist, error has no rights. And the role of government is to codify in our laws the intolerance that is in their hearts. We saw the fundamentalist temptation indulged a decade ago in Massachusetts, when Catholic Charities of Boston was forced to stop providing adoption services because they would not, and indeed could not, place children in the homes of same-sex couples because their religious beliefs prohibited them from doing so. And we've seen it more recently in the case of the Little Sisters of the Poor, a religious order of nuns who provide end-of-life care to the needy, giving them a home where they can be treated with love and dignity and grace throughout their twilight days. By any measure, the Little Sisters' devotion to the dignity of human life is nothing short of heroic. But for the past 2 years, the Obama administration has treated them like criminals, relentlessly threatening them with crippling fines that would surely bankrupt their ministry. And for what? Well, for asking the federal government for permission to continue operating their ministry without being forced to purchase a health insurance policy that provides coverage for contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs against their religious beliefs. But the government has repeatedly denied the Little Sisters' requests, insisting that they're somehow not religious enough to qualify for an exemption. Never mind the absurdity of a group of government bureaucrats in Washington telling nuns that they're not religious enough. What's most troubling in this case, and in a growing number of other cases like it, is the presumption that a free conscience is not a God-given right, but is instead somehow a government-granted privilege. This is not the posture of a government operating on behalf of a free people, but rather a government in service to an official orthodoxy. You don't need to subscribe to any particular faith or hold any particular beliefs about abortion or marriage to see the danger of a government forcing innocent people to violate their own conscience over a partisan triviality, no less, when they're just trying to make a living. They're just trying to serve their community, or they're just trying to educate the next generation. The bad news is that some on the left see in this very dynamic, in this very sequence of events, not danger, but opportunity. The good news is we can too. We should never lose sight of the fact that the marriage equality movement is succeeding not by focusing on marriage, but by focusing on equality. We should too focus on equality. Political conservatives and religious traditionalists may not like how the gay marriage debate is going, but it is no small thing that the gay marriage movement has succeeded in recent years only by adopting our principles of tolerance, diversity, and equal opportunity. And it is those principles, those very principles, not the parties currently enjoying their political resonance, that hold the high ground in this debate. And because those of us who believe in religious freedom hold those principles in our hearts, and not just in our political quiver, that high ground remains still open and available to us. The opportunity exists now, and it will expand if the court rules as most expect it to rule in the next 2.5 weeks or so. For Americans of goodwill to come together to reinforce religious liberty and to further protect and enrich not just the free exercise of religion, but also all of the free space that it inhabits and that it influences. Soon, it seems likely that America's public square will fully welcome married same-sex couples, not as victims or revolutionaries, but simply as equals. Just as America has mostly avoided traditional conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, Christians and Jews, Sunni and Shia, atheists and believers, so too, Americans' commitment to tolerance, diversity, and dignity is, I think, perfectly capable of making room for the rights and dignity of those who disagree about the meaning of marriage. But good faith compromise of the sort that is Americans' unique political genius is possible only if the government gives us the space to find it. And those tempted by fundamentalism will be loath to afford us this very space, lest they let a manufactured crisis go to waste. So Americans who believe in religious freedom, who believe in religious liberty and are committed to it, have two jobs now. First, we cannot hide this issue under a bushel and hope that no one asks us about it. We will have this debate. The only question is whether we start a conversation or we let the fundamentalists on the other side of this debate pick a fight. The American people need and deserve to have this debate. So their representatives must engage it with candor and compassion in the most publicly accountable venues possible. This is a crucial point for those of us who work in capitals and county seats across the country. If the coming conversation about religious freedom is left to the judicial and executive branches of our government, acting alone, all Americans, whether they know it or not, will lose that debate even before it begins. Court rulings and executive regulations tend to be much more one-sided, far more sweeping, and infinitely more prescriptive, winner-take-all sorts of propositions, and thus should have as little as possible to do with the delicate diversity of 320 million souls' deepest religious beliefs. Instead, we must advance the debate in the legislative branches of government at every level within the United States of America, at the local, state, and federal levels, because it is in the nature of legislative bodies to find compromise, to ground policy in real-world interactions, and to respect minority views and rights. That, for instance, is what the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is and how it came about, and why, contrary to propaganda claiming otherwise, it has worked so well now for more than 2 decades. As President Bill Clinton put it the day that he signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law, this law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, protects, quote, the space of freedom between government and people of faith that otherwise government might usurp, close quote. If we want to reinforce religious liberty in America, our first step must be to protect that crucial space of freedom from undue government interference. That is the principle behind a bill I will soon introduce in the Senate. My bill would protect the tens of thousands of religiously affiliated schools in America, preschools through colleges and universities, from government discrimination. And it would prevent any agency from denying federal tax exemption, any grants, contracts, accreditations, licenses, or certifications to an individual or institution based on a belief that marriage is between a man and a woman. Moving forward, the debate will be less and less about marriage and more about freedom of conscience. Those of us who value that basic human right have the better of the argument. But that matters only if we have the courage to make the argument at every opportunity and before every audience. This then is the second, and perhaps the more important task facing the friends of religious liberty today. We must be more than citizens. We must be witnesses, not just to our own understanding of religious truth, but to the universal truth that man is not free unless his conscience is free. As many in this room know, to live as a witness to such a profound and important fact is to be inspired by and to inspire in others the quiet confidence of truth. The way of the witness is not through the halls of influence or the force of intimidation, but through the unassuming power of example. We all have our own heroes to show us the way. For me, and for many Utahns, our path is forever illuminated by the example given to us by the early leaders of my church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You often hear that the first generation of Mormons were pioneers, and that's certainly true. But it misses the crucial point. You see, they moved from New York to Ohio, to Missouri, to Illinois, and finally to what eventually became Utah, not by choice, but by force. Wherever the Mormons lived, they were persecuted as heretics and driven from their homes. At each new settlement, they would stay as long as they could until the intermittent abuse grew into an existential threat. And then they'd move on. There were the not-so-random acts of violence suffered at the hands of the mob that left entire communities trapped in a state of perpetual anxiety and sometimes fatherlessness. And then there were the systematic, state-sponsored efforts to destroy the LDS faith itself. In Missouri, the governor used his police powers to issue an extermination order against the entire church. Keep in mind, this is not ancient history. This was in 1838. The governor's order read, quote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace," close quote. But the faithful were undeterred. They continued to push the frontier, not as pioneers, but as pilgrims, in search of their own promised land, and as witnesses to the truth that everyone has an equal and fundamental right to free conscience. Shortly after leaving Missouri, Joseph Smith, the church's founder, delivered a sermon that articulated the spirit of living as a witness. "If I esteem mankind to be in error," Smith asked, "shall I bear them down? No," he declared, "I will lift them up. And in their own way, too, if I cannot persuade them, my way is better. And I will not seek to compel any man to believe as I do, only by the force of reasoning, for truth will cut its own way." Truth will cut its own way. As witnesses to that truth, in our pursuit of protecting religious liberty, we must proceed with resolve and conviction, and also with cheerfulness and with clarity. To truly succeed, we must be gracious and civil and solicitous, not only to preserve our own freedom, but the equal freedom, too, of those who disagree with us, those who are, though we may sometimes be tempted to forget, our brothers and sisters and friends just the same. If we can do this, as we've done before, the truth will once again cut its own way, and all of us will be free to follow. Thank you very much, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you, Senator. The Senator has time for a few questions. And, Senator, since we're a college, our first question will be from a student, Jacob. Right here. Go ahead.
Senator Lee, thank you. Senator Lee, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. As a student, just how can we protect, just not only at Hillsdale, but across the country, how can we protect our freedoms of speech, of association, of religion in general, just across the country and on college campuses?
First of all, I'm pleased that you're referring to those rights, those interests, those values and virtues as part of a whole. I think that's one important way of protecting them, is to understand that they're related. Our rights to freedom of expression, to free exercise of religion, and our associational rights are all interconnected. And you can't really harm one without harming all the others. You can't adequately protect one without protecting all the others. I also think that as we go about doing this, it helps us to understand that this problem and the need to protect these rights will always have both cultural and legal ramifications. In other words, if we focus just on legislative efforts, just on the legal and the political, but we neglect the cultural, we might find ourselves ultimately on the losing side of history. And so while we'll continue to push for legislation like what I've described here today, which I do think is needed, because after all, we need to keep the government out of the business of discriminating against people based on their religious beliefs, we also simultaneously need to work on the cultural component of it. And as with all things, the best way to start with that is with yourself and with your own family, with your own community of friends and neighbors. And what I mean by this is that in your interactions with your fellow students, family members, and friends, try to remember that although you don't agree with the views of everyone around you, and you may often strongly disagree with them, whenever we're respectful of competing beliefs, whether they're religious beliefs or otherwise, we tend to elevate the public discourse in a way that makes our society as a whole more welcoming of religious diversity.
Yes, Senator. My name is Kammi Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is about religious freedom using social welfares on the Mormon or Muslim model for the people who are unfortunate or poor or for some reason are left behind. I remember Reagan administration thought it very seriously adopting Mormon model of helping citizens to get a job or to help them to just become a productive citizen of the society. And my question is, being a member of the church, can you push this agenda to use that Mormon model for the country because it's very productive? And my second question is, you already addressed that. What do you think about perceived Muslim victimization? I used perceived because most terrorism spring from Muslim countries, and you can't blame American for perceiving them in such a fashion. But the fact that both your church and Muslim currently in the United States share that experience, do you have any opinion about their perceived victimization? Thanks.
Okay, I'm happy to answer both of them. I'm not sure I understand the first question. Tell me what it is you're asking the first question.
Using Mormon and Muslim model, social welfare model for the welfare of the citizen who are poor, left behind, or unfortunate in our country.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, on the first part of the question, I've long believed that the very best thing that we can do as a country, the best thing any country can do to foster an environment where upward mobility, economically and otherwise, is possible and where it becomes the norm, the best thing we can do is to strengthen two institutions that I think are essential for upward mobility, economically and otherwise. And that is institutions of civil society, voluntary institutions of civil society, and free markets. When we have free markets and robust institutions of civil society, and by this I mean the family, churches, synagogues, mosques, other charitable orders, fraternal associations, and so forth, voluntary associations that are not part of government. The more we can protect those two things, the better off the poor will be, the greater the chance they'll have of getting out of poverty. And so, yeah, I absolutely do believe that your religion and mine, as well as many other religious orders and other components of civil society, play a very key role in that. In fact, it's an indispensable role. If we think government can solve poverty, and that if government tries to do this at the exclusion of others, that it will be anything other than disastrous, is folly. So I completely agree with you on that. That needs to happen. As to your second question, yeah, I do think people who belong to my church and people who have any kind of faith, the type of which has caused them or their ancestors to be the victims of religious discrimination, share a special kinship. And for that reason, I'm always on the lookout for other religious minorities and making sure that they're not singled out for discrimination, either by fellow citizens or even worse, by the government itself for any kind of discrimination. And I think we're very much united in that.
Hi, Senator. John Ward from Yahoo News. Is it on? Thank you. On the question of culture, your answer to the first question, I think anybody in this room who agrees with you, especially as a young person, is probably aware of the fact that one of the obstacles to the cultural question for conservatives is that opposition to same-sex marriage has become viewed by some percentage of Americans, especially the younger they skew, as a form of bigotry or racism. So how do you, in the public square, that's not really as relevant to the legislative component, but in the cultural argument, how do you personally answer that particular question?
Yeah, I think that's actually very consistent with the point I was trying to make there, is that the marriage equality movement has been very successful, largely because of the appeal of the part of the argument that focuses not on marriage, but on equality. And so too, those of us who feel the need to protect religious freedom by protecting all people of religious belief and all people of no religious belief as equal would do well to do the same. And to make clear to others that particularly when government acts, government needs to be very careful to act with neutrality and to treat people equally, regardless of their race and in particular, regardless of their religious belief. I think we would do well, those of us who are concerned about religious freedom would again do well to remember that the marriage equality movement has been successful largely because it's focused on equality. Did you have a follow-up on that?
Do you think that that question, though, you kind of talked about allowing space for people of all views to have those views, but do you think that point of view that I articulated, that this is a form of bigotry, needs to be engaged? And how? If so, how?
Okay. I don't doubt that there are people out there who hold bigoted views in this area. I do, however, think that it is a mistake to say that anyone who doesn't share the end of the religious or of the marriage equality view does so for bigoted reasons. I think that's incorrect. But yeah, I think it's important to have the discussion and to focus on the fact that there are reasons that have nothing to do with bigotry, why some people hold that view.